We spend so much time, writing our cues, getting the mix right, making sure that it has all the form and structure, it has your edit points, and then we work on our deliverables. We give them the stems and the metadata and everything that an editor could possibly need. But once we kind of hand it off to the library, we're we're kind of flying blind. I mean, will the editor use our cues? Will the cue survive a restructuring of a scene or a show, or is it getting tossed because we didn't give the editor what they needed? Well, this week, I'm joined by Biagio Messina, who is a television producer and editor and composer who's been right in the middle of all of it. He's built shows from the ground up, edited with a composer's mindset, and knows exactly what makes a cue usable and what gets a cue cut. So we're talking about cue survivability, stem strategies, and how to give your music its best shot to making it on air. On this week's episode of the 52 Cues podcast. What is happening, everybody? This is Dave Kropf, and welcome back to another episode of the 52 Cues podcast, where each week we are talking about all things production and library music. So whether you're just starting out or maybe you're already seeing your cues on TV, I promise you, you are in the right place. Today's episode is made possible thanks to the continued support of our member subscribers at 52 Cues, who are composers just like you, working to write better cues and find success in the sync music industry. And 52 Cues is there to help make that happen with live streams, workshops, Zoom feedback sessions, working with real libraries, and a whole lot more. So if you're curious about joining us, you can head over to 52cues.com or just stick around because I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later in today's episode. Speaking of today's episode, I'm joined by Biagio Messina, who is a producer and editor who's also a composer, and we're going to be talking about how editors actually work with our cues in real-world productions. We're going to get into what makes a cue usable, what helps it stick, and how we as composers can make better decisions before our music ever hits a timeline. Plus, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on a TV drama cue from 52 Cues member James Oakden. But first, what have I been working on lately? Well, this golf documentary just kind of won't go away. I talked last week, I think it was, about a cue. They needed music for a feature story. And then before then, they needed more drone cues, but it needed to be like uplifting drone cues. So yeah, it seems like we're writing cues, and then the producers, as they are editing things, they come back and they say, hey, we need this. And so the last cue, I'm hoping, knock on wood, I think I've put together 14 cues for this project, but the last cue is an uplifting, positive, corporate rock pop cue, and this is called Streets of Green. And this was very much inspired by a certain 80s, 90s, 2000s pop group from Ireland. To see if you can spot the reference. If you said U2 and Where the Streets Have No Name, you are correct. Unfortunately, Coldplay is insufficient. Yeah, this was a cue that was referenced off of Where the Streets Have No Name, and was unapologetically inspired by the Strong Songs podcast. If you've ever checked out that podcast, it is fantastic. The host, whose name is totally escaping me right now, but it's called Strong Songs, and he does a deep dive into different songs. And he took this and connected this with or Without You, and talked a lot about U2's kind of songwriting process and the different layers that they use, and like the Edge's guitar technique and everything. Now, even though this was done all by me, I am not a guitarist. I am really super proud of some of my guitar work on this. And so, yeah, it's called Streets of Green. I did have to work to make sure that it didn't sound too much like I was cloning it, and I had to kind of push it into more uplifting, orchestral, positive, cinematic territory. So we're getting into the brass and strings and all of that a little bit later, in the queue, that is. For you family and friends subscribers, I'm going to be doing a complete breakdown of this queue coming up soon over in the community. And for you family, friends, and neighbor subscribers, I wrote this during one of our recent live streams. So if you want to see this queue get written from scratch, that archive is already available. So moving on to today's topic, I am thrilled to welcome Biagio Messina to the podcast, who is a producer, filmmaker, and composer, and he works deep in the trenches of television. I mean, he's worked on everything from true crime docuseries to network reality shows. He's even been on screen in a show that anybody who was, at least a teenager or a kid in the 90s is going to recognize this show. But he has worn just about every hat you can think of, including probably some he'd probably rather forget. Well, he's also a longtime 52 Qs member, and what makes his story so compelling is he understands the industry from so many different angles. As a producer and an editor, he knows exactly what makes a cue usable. And as a composer, he's in the DAW making the same decisions that we make, choosing sounds, building out stems, sending deliverables, and hoping the cue actually survives the final cut. And in our chat, we talk about stem strategy, cue structure, and what editors are really thinking when they open up a folder and look at all of the options available. The conversation today, it's a behind-the-scenes look at how music actually gets used on TV from someone who's using it every single day. So here's my conversation with Biagio Messina. I am so thrilled to finally welcome to the podcast Biagio Messina. He is a producer, he is a director, he's an actor, he is also a composer, and you've worn so many hats, but welcome to the podcast, Biagio Messina. What has happened, my man?
Oh, man. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm not going to lie. I'm a little starstruck because I've been watching your show for like 5 years. And just to kiss your butt for a second, I made a quick list of why I think your show is so awesome. And one, I think it's so cool when professionals teach what they know, because the ideas of mentorship and apprenticeship are just so overlooked these days. And on top of it, a lot of professionals who teach can't actually teach. Still useful information you can actually teach.
Thank you.
So you're a professional who knows how to teach. And I think your ideas of, being an artisan and how you approach just mentally the whole creative business, a little bit of stoicism thrown in. I mean, your channel's got it all. So, just a little words of love for you. I don't watch a lot of stuff on YouTube. You're one of the ones that I do. So.
Well, if you've ever wanted to know what a bearded bald guy looks like blushing, this is what happens to your head when you blush. Biagio, that is high praise, because I could say the same for you. I have so much respect for you. And, we've been trying to kind of coordinate this for quite a while because because of all of the hats that you wear. And when I say, you have seen you've been in front of the camera, you've been behind the camera, you've been beside the camera, you have, the camera was, 6 months ago. And so you're doing post-production. You're also a composer. You are just a genuinely nice guy. And I feel like you're like one of us. And so having you on the podcast is an absolute pleasure and an absolute joy.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
The fact that you work with your wife as well, that's coming from a business owner in the creative industry.
How did I not put that on the list? We're both married, working together. I mean, my gosh, that's another thing.
Yeah,
I love that about you.
And so it's amazing. But let's talk about all of these different hats, and we're gonna kind of touch into it, including your time on Kenan and Kel. But more on that later. It blows my mind. You've worn a ton of hats. Like I said, producer, editor, filmmaker, composer. Walk back to the beginning. How did you end up here?
Wow. So as a kid growing up in Cleveland, and I had a dream, which was to play in the NBA. And that did not work out.
Didn't work out.
I'm not even kidding. I was a starting point guard in 8th grade. I thought it was the hottest thing. Yeah, I stopped growing when I hit 5'6". I should have known.
Yeah. I know there are a lot of teams recruiting out of high school, but I think recruiting out of middle school is probably
there was no one at my 8th grade games that wanted me to go pro. Nope. But aside from the sports thing, I was always really into movies and TV, writing. And listen, let's be honest. It's not like there's a real hopping showbiz scene in Cleveland. At least there wasn't in the late 80s, early 90s. So you sort of had to be really crafty to figure out how to build a career. And I sort of started with this idea that if I could learn how to do everything, if every single part of it, top to bottom, that no matter what, at least I would be able to make stuff. If I wanted to make, back then it would have been a short film. There was no YouTube, right? This is ancient times. There was no social media, but I had this idea. I didn't know it then, but these days I consider it hands-on producing, which is the idea that, especially today, even more so than, when I was growing up, you can learn how to do anything. So if what you enjoy is making stuff, there's a way to get it done. And that's kind of what I started in Cleveland, and it was like, okay, I learned how to carry a cheap video camera. I always played piano growing up, so I played around with the idea of scoring. This is before there was DAWs or anything, it was impossible. And so I think I started with the one thing that you could do, which was writing. And I'd won some creative writing contests in middle school. Again, sorry, my headphones are falling off. I had written a play in high school that won a local young playwrights festival and got put up at a theater. And it was like, I was like, okay, I'm making progress as a writer. I also enjoyed acting. There wasn't a whole lot of acting jobs in Cleveland, believe it or not. I made a living for a while doing singing telegrams for a place called Eastern Onion.
Okay,
by the way,
you've got to give us a little taste of that.
Well, I can't sing, which was hilarious. And I would do everything from 40th birthday parties to the kids' birthday parties. I would go dressed up like the purple dinosaur. We couldn't say the B word because they didn't license it. So I was Purple Dino, I'll never forget. I would go to some of these neighborhoods in Cleveland, and this one mom took me aside. She was like, "You got to take this costume off before you leave because someone's going to shoot you." So I was like, wow, who knew singing telegrams could be such a rough job?
Yeah,
that got me out of my shell. After that, getting in front of people was no big deal. But that was, I was the talking Christmas tree at the mall. I also dressed up like Tweety Bird at the local Cleveland mall. I mean, whatever a job I could get related to entertainment, I took. Then I went to a place called Cuyahoga Community College. And I got to tell you, I'm so lucky I went there. And this also speaks to why I love the fact that you are a teacher and you do it well. When I went to my community college, every single teacher there was a part-time teacher and a full-time whatever they were teaching. The guy who taught us camera work was the local news shooter. The teacher teaching acting ran the local theater. They were all people that taught part-time, but knew what they were teaching because they did it full time.
Right.
So while I was there, again, just because I always find a way to do these hilarious mashups, I managed to get the campus police department to give me a work-study job, and then I talked them into letting me make public safety videos. So I was like, all right. So now I'm making minimum wage to make these little videos. Then one of the cops there got me to start writing for the local DARE program. And I wiggled my way into just a few different filmmaking jobs. You know, I would shoot it. I'd work with the teacher there to edit it, because at the time I wasn't editing yet. I'd write some of the music for it, you know, and it was just ways to harness my skills. I got into UCLA, which I felt so lucky and so grateful for, because I had kind of tapped out the market in Cleveland. I was acting. I did some TV commercials, so I got in the acting unions, you know, and I went to my interview at UCLA, and I'll never forget the guy who was interviewing us. He looks at me, he goes, "So what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I just started laughing, and I said, "What I'm doing now. I'm getting paid to write, direct, and act. Like, I don't want to do anything different." And he was like, he looked so shocked. Like, his mind was blown, but I'm just like, I'm not looking to be like a trillionaire. Like, I like writing, I like acting, I like directing, I like making stuff, you know? And so I'll never forget how hard he laughed when I told him that. And I got the letter like months later that I was accepted. And the third day of school, I met my wife. Her name is Joke. She's from Belgium. I didn't know that at the time. Funny side story, I'll tell you later. But I met her and we got to talking. And she said, "You know, I'm convinced the only way to make it in this business is to produce your own projects." And I was like, dude, this is on.
I mean, isn't that why like Lin-Manuel Miranda started writing musicals? Because he wasn't getting cast in anything. He's like, I'll do it myself.
That's right. By the way, a guy who's doing much better than I am. So
hey, man, it's all relative, right?
Yeah, but yes, you know, like it was that whole idea, and I was so excited that I met someone else at UCLA that felt that way. And so, you know, immediately we started working together, and I had just auditioned. Okay, I don't know if I've ever told this story publicly before, but I had just auditioned to be on this game show called Majority Rules. It was this new game show. They were testing it in a few markets. And so I said to her in the hallway, I said, "Hey, I'm going to go on this new game show." I didn't even know I was on the game show yet. I had just auditioned. I said, "Maybe I'll win some money and we'll make a movie." Now, keep in mind, I was flat broke. I was on total financial aid at UCLA, taking out Pell Grants and every loan you could get. A couple weeks later, I won $38,000 on this game show.
Oh, so you weren't going there to like, I'm going to audition to host it. You are going to be a contestant.
Oh, no, a contestant. Oh, yeah, dude. Nobody was letting me audition for anything when I got to LA. They were like, nobody knew me. I was in both unions. Nobody cared. So I went and I won this money, and together we made our first film. It was on 16 millimeter. It was before digital video, but that was the start of our career. And I think that was also the way that we're sort of built and grounded. Is like, we want to know how to do every single thing. Because if we want to finish something ourselves, we can. And so before we ever sold the TV show, before we ever had a film in theaters, like, that was what we were doing. We're just making stuff in our apartment. And so it never seemed weird to me to learn how to do everything. By the way, if I'm rambling, feel free to cut me off at any point.
No, we'll just edit it out.
There you go.
We won't edit any of this. This show isn't edited.
But what we decided to do was leverage technology then. And it's really interesting right now because you hear people talking about AI and freaking out about it and stuff, and that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
But at the time, there were not a lot of people who were editing like at their house. You know, Premiere was around, but it was before the Creative Cloud days. There was no Final Cut Pro, and nobody knew what After Effects was. Like, nobody had ever even heard of it. So we're like, let's just make some TV shows. Like, top to bottom, we'll do everything. We'll do the graphics, we'll do the sound mixing, we'll color correct it, you know. And we were surprised at the reaction we got, because in a parallel universe at the time, we were trying to write screenplays, and we had gotten an agent for screenwriting. But our unscripted career just took off. We walked in with these tapes we made, and people thought we spent like $250,000, $300,000 on them, and we'd made them for like $50. But nobody was making graphics at the time. So for us, that was like our lever. We leveraged technology to sort of get through the door. And it was before social media, so we stretched the truth a little bit to get some meetings, got through some doors. But when they saw our stuff, they liked it. And within a very short time, we went from having no credits to being executive producers and having our own company and making television shows. And I really think it was the leveraging of the technology and the decision to learn how to do every single thing ourselves. That was how we got through that door. Yes, along the way, I had done some acting. I know you mentioned that. So that's wrapped up in there.
I feel like we have to talk about this. I was exactly, 2 months ago old before I realized that you were Mark, right? Mark on Kenan and Kel.
Mark Cram, yes, sir.
Okay, all right. Unpack that a little bit, because that's not an insignificant type of a credit.
Well, listen, I feel so fortunate, okay? Because if there's one thing I learned out here, especially if you're an actor, getting any kind of job is a miracle. And I've met a lot of actors who are far more successful than I ever was. And I met a lot of people who are far more talented than I am who've never gotten an acting gig. So I looked into it. And actually it was funny because singing telegrams sort of played into it. So here's what happened. I finally got an agent. I had gotten in the unions in Ohio. This agent was like not really sold on me. She wasn't feeling me, and she kept trying to get me auditions, and no one was seeing me. So finally, she gets me this audition for this nerdy character on the show Kenan and Kel. And I was super excited because one of my singing telegram characters was this really annoying nerdy guy. And I actually it was my own glasses. I had these really ugly glasses and I still had them. So I showed up in the glasses and the jacket I used to wear for singing telegrams, which was like this plaid jacket. And I went in and I auditioned, and it was for the role of this Mark Cram, who's a spelling champion. In the script I auditioned, he was the spelling champion of the world. They dialed it back in the show to just the spelling champion of the United States. I guess they thought the world was too big.
That's where that's where we draw the line here on realism, guys. Yeah.
Too much. But I auditioned, and the audition went well. And at the end of it, I said, "Hey, I have this special skill, and I'd like to show you." And they were like, "Well, what's this going to be?" In 8th grade, we had to learn the longest word in the dictionary, which was pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis. And I thought, when is this ever going to come in handy in life? And so I stood there and I went, I know the longest word in the dictionary. Pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis. PNEUMONOULTRAMICROSCOPSCSALICOVOLCANOCONIOSIS. It means lung disease. And they just busted up laughing. And they said, okay, you have to come back tonight and do it just like that. And this is what I found out about Hollywood auditions. I got back that night for this callback. I was so excited. There was 50 other guys that looked just like me. I'm so not getting this.
Not feeling so special anymore.
Yeah, no. And then they come out when it was my turn. I'm going to go, listen, we don't want you to freak out when you walk in there. There's someone you might recognize who's going to be directing the episode. Just, play it cool. They didn't tell me who. They told me whatever. So I'm like, oh, great. So I walk in, and it was Kim Fields, Tootie from Facts of Life, is sitting there. And I'm like, I grew up, I don't know how many of your viewers watched Facts of Life growing up, but
we have a pretty solid Gen X. You take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have freaking Kim Fields.
Yeah, it was amazing. So I was like, okay, so I did the audition. I was just grateful I got to meet her. I left, and I'm like, there's no way I'm getting it. And the next day they called me and they said, you got the part. It was just for one episode. So I was super psyched. It was my first real job. It was my first real audition for a TV show. And I did the episode, and the last day of shooting the episode, I was leaving and the guard said, hey, I asked them if I should get you a parking spot, and they told me, we think so. And I was like, you're kidding. She's like, no. She's like, I think they like you. And so first time I heard about it was from the security guard who ran the parking lot. So sure enough, every few weeks they started to bring me back, and I am doing a bunch of episodes, season 3 and season 4. But that was my foray into acting, and they brought me over for a few episodes of All That, and I did like an episode of ER, and honestly, my best acting story was I got to meet the Coen brothers at a callback audition. I didn't get the part, but meeting them, as far as that was the highlight of my whole acting career, was just being in a room with them.
Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou is on my Mount Rushmore of movies,
Yes.
But that's even still, that's a far cry from Unmasking a Killer and Devil in Suburbia, right? So Did you always kind of have an ear for like crime, like reality
No.
TV, or how did we get from whatever that big giant word you just spelled, the nerd, to what you really do so exceptionally well, and what is your kind of bread and butter these days, which is producing and creating these really powerful, visceral kind of crime shows. Where does that bridge come from?
Yeah, it's a wild journey. Well, I'll say this: when we were thinking about getting into, what I refer to as unscripted, because it's
Mhm.
such a spectrum. Because to
Yeah,
me, a reality show is so different than a show like The First 48 on A&E, which is so different from Duck Dynasty, which is also on A&E,
right.
and completely
And
different.
Black Ink Crew and Toddlers and Tiaras, and yeah,
Yeah, it's
I
it's
have
a
that.
whole
Yeah,
spectrum.
I have that conversation with my Full Sail students. We have to make a designation between unscripted and reality TV. Reality television isn't a documentary. They are manufactured situations, but nobody's necessarily reading lines of dialogue. Anyway.
Yes, no, it is definitely a spectrum. But I think well, sort of how we fell into it, we were writing scripts, you know, and at the time, everybody, again, showing my age, everybody was writing scripts that were kind of like Kevin Smith ripoffs, right?
Mhm.
Everybody was writing their version of Clerks. Two people sitting around in a coffee shop complaining. It was like everybody was either writing that or they were trying to be, Richard Linklater and doing these really weird off kilter things. And so we were like, why don't we just start doing some documentary more so that we get out and meet real people?
Mm.
Because what's going to inspire our screenplays is it would be far better to be inspired by real people than trying to rip off Kevin Smith. And, nothing against Kevin Smith. I love him. He's great.
Yeah.
That's why he made a name for himself. But we wanted to carve out like our own niche, and we just felt like we were young, we were in our 20s. We're like, what do we know about life? We're trying to write screenplays, we want to win an Oscar someday. Like, I just got out of UCLA, So we sort of got in the doc, and it was really interesting because we started to feel like it was way more exciting because you never knew what a real person was going to say or do. And you always learned something new. And we were like, at first it was like really informing our writing, but then we were like, this is like more fun.
Mm.
And so we weren't the main producers on it, but we had teamed up with some producers to do this Star Wars documentary when the first prequel came out.
Okay.
People were sleeping in the streets for like 48 days or whatever it was, and so we shot this documentary. It got a small theatrical, which was a big deal for us. We didn't make any money on it, but it was like, okay, we can do this. And then Survivor hit. And so we're like in our little 1-bedroom apartment in Hollywood, and we're talking to each other, and we're like, we could make this with the gear we have.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, not a desert island, but like we could do unscripted. So what if we start trying to get into that world? And so we just started shooting with the cameras we had and editing with with Premiere. I think it was 4.1 at the time. It wasn't even a Final Cut Pro. Final Cut didn't even exist yet. And we just started making stuff. And we just sort of, all of a sudden, for whatever reason, that end of our career took off. And eventually we were running a show called Beauty and the Geek, which was like our first giant credit.
Mm.
So we were what they call the showrunners, which is like we were co-executive producers. We were in charge of the day-to-day. We answered to Ashton Kutcher and to Three Ball, who was the actual production company. And at the same time, we were doing some verite documentaries for this guy named R.J. Cutler. He did this documentary called The War Room, and at the time he was doing like big sort of like true documentary series. So we had like this very, scattered upbringing, which was cool because we would sell documentaries to like the doc side. Like we did an MTV True Life, and we did a true documentary series for MTV called Caged. But then we were doing like comedy for IFC. We were doing a show called Commercial Kings with these guys, Rhett and Link, who are now these big giant YouTube stars. So it was like, we were making everything. And for us, we always came back to, we just want to tell cool stories. Mm-hmm. In our DNA was this, coming up writing and learning how to tell stories, loving great stories. And each of these shows was a chance to tell just a different kind of story. So we didn't really care so much about the genre. We felt happy that we were getting to make stuff. And as a plus, the budgets are so tiny that you kind of have to do everything yourself. They
Yeah.
can't be mad at you for directing or doing the graphics. In fact, usually they're grateful because you're stretching the budget, you know? So you end up building all these other skills where there's just not enough money to get things done. So that was sort of how it was all happening. And then one day we were getting ready to go to this place called Real Screen, which is like a convention for unscripted television producers. And my wife called me. She was shooting actually the MTV True Life episode in Ohio, and I was editing another show in LA at the time. And she said, "Hey, I have an idea for this show. It's called She Made Me Do It. It's a true crime show, you know, and it's where the guy says, well, she made me do it." I'm like, sounds hilarious. Like that's exactly the kind of stuff they're making right now. So I cut a pitch tape that day. I cut like that day, 5 hours. I edited the pitch tape. The next day we flew to Real Screen and an exec there bought it. And that's how we got into true crime.
Wow.
And I think that was over 10 years ago now. And it was really interesting because on the surface at first you're interested because it's almost like making a mini movie. You know, you get to shoot the reenactments, you try to make them look pretty. So everything you ever wanted to do as a filmmaker, you're having fun with. At the same time, you quickly learn how serious the subject matter is, you know, and you quickly learn why people want to or don't want to do these television shows, you know. Let's be honest, in true crime, anybody who's telling their story has gone through something horrific.
That's right.
And sometimes they don't want to talk about it again. And I completely, 100% respect that.
Yeah, I mean,
and sometimes,
I'm sorry, one of the reasons
No.
that it's taken kind of so long for us to connect on this very interview is I think when we first started talking, you're like, I'm in the middle of cutting this show and I'm taping and it could be considered like not a liability, but you're like, I have to be really aware that I am filming like crime things happening. And so that was the first time I went like, oh, like this is crime, like real crime with real victims and real stakes. And yeah, we might see it on TV and we might digest it just as quickly as we would an episode of Daredevil or something. But this is real life. And so that was really impactful for me as somebody who makes music for these types of shows to realize, wow, there are real people with real pain behind these very real stories.
There really are. And a lot of them want to tell the story because they want to keep the memory of their loved one alive. There's a lesson they want to share with the world. Like, just don't do this. Like, if only she would have done X, she would have been okay. You know, and they want to share that message. Sometimes, you know, on some of our shows, there was justice ends up being served after. You know, we did Unmasking a Killer and Unraveled, and there was actually arrests, you know, that came after both of those shows, which was, you know, the family members were extremely grateful. And that's something that really impacts you, you know, when someone comes to you and is like, you helped catch my dad's killer, which, by the way, no, we told the story. We happened to be there and maybe we gave the police a little shove, but they caught it, not us. But just the fact that they feel like the programming played a role in their healing, like that to me is the best possible case scenario in true crime. And to me, the worst case scenario is when you're just doing straight up tabloid and the police aren't involved, the families aren't involved, and you're just telling a story that maybe nobody wants to tell.
Right. You're exploiting somebody else's pain, you know, for financial gain or recognition or whatever. Yeah.
And arguably, there's a huge swath of entertainment that does that, right? I mean, how many movies get made that are true stories, and I'm sure the people they're being told about wouldn't want them. You know, very highfalutin movies that everybody loves and adores. So there's always that's on your mind. But anyways, that was our entree into true crime. And I think because we loved filmmaking, because we loved real people, and because we weren't afraid to go talk to them. Yeah. You know, it was the one thing we had to get over was, you know, my wife's name is Joke. Our company's name is Joke Productions. And let me tell you, when you call the FBI and you're like, hey, I'm Biagio from Joke Productions.
Honk, 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 you know.
Yeah, they're like, what? they don't want to talk to you at all. And that actually changed when we did Unmasking a Killer. They caught the Golden State Killer 9 days after we finished airing. And at the press conference, the district attorney actually quoted our documentary, which was insane. It was a huge honor. And she was quoting a letter from a survivor whose dad had been killed. And she was she was, basically saying that the survivor thought it was beautifully edited. And that meant the world to us. But also at that point, every single police, outfit in the nation was willing to talk to us because they knew, okay, well, we're trying to tell stories about catching bad guys and helping families. And so that sort of kicked the true crime thing into high gear. And so that's where we're doing a lot of that, a lot of that type of programming right now. So that's how we got there.
I could imagine like some really serious like moment, and then joke productions. Yeah, I could see the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance that might cause.
Yeah. Well, no, so it's my wife's name. It doesn't mean anything in Belgium. Obviously over here, it's a little bit different. So
Right. Well, one of the things that I haven't heard you mention and I'm interested in is how composing and writing music, because in addition to all of this other stuff, you're also a writer, you're a composer. So where did that come into play, and how has your view of music kind of evolved over the years? Or was you being a composer kind of a product of, hey, I need music, and so I guess I'll just write it myself? I mean, talk about that aspect of your career.
So it's a little bit of a mix of things. I grew up playing the piano. My grandmother was actually the cleaning lady at a high school when I was very young, and they were throwing a piano away, and she got it to our house, and it was this out of tune piano, which is probably why I can't sing in tune. I'm sure I have these wild out of tune notes in my head from when I was learning to play at 3 and 4 years old.
Maybe that's why you were such a successful singing telegrammist.
It was more like screaming telegrams. I think by the time it was done. But so I'd always had a love, for music. And, when I was in 8th grade, I was going to start a band called Biagio, like Bon Jovi. And thank God that went nowhere. But when we started like really making TV and DAWs became a thing, I really enjoyed the idea of taking like our Foley and our field sounds and just weird sounds from the field and turning them into cues nobody else had, and I still do that to this day. Like on Operation Undercover, I had a whole like mini library of boots hitting the ground, clicks and clanks, they're tank-like vehicles driving down the road. And I would just build cues out of those just so I would have something different, I always like to think in some imaginary world, like creatively, on some deep level, the viewer feels it. And my wife's like, yeah, no, they're doing their laundry while they're watching our show. And I'm like, you're right. But on the upside, I got a cue no one else has got,
there
right?
you go. Yeah.
So I had been doing that for a while. And, it was funny. A big part of like me starting to compose more and more often, it was two things. One, it relaxes me. Believe it or not, producing television can at times be a high-stress job, especially when you're an independently owned company and you're between shows. You got to have a high tolerance for risk and a high tolerance for stress, which luckily my wife and I both mostly do. But I do find that like, sometimes just sitting down and composing cues for a couple hours just sets me straight, and gets me out of my head and back to a place where I can go back and be creative, developing shows or writing whatever development the exec is asking for, or editing something I've been staring at for 20 hours straight, So I started doing it more and more. And then, as if on cue, pun intended, I discovered the 52 Cues podcast. And I'm not even kidding. I was looking for, I always look for just interesting tutorials. Like, what's a way to make a crazy sound I haven't tried. And you had this tutorial about using those, they were like rubber mallets, I think, on some kind of drum, right?
Yep, they're like right here. I keep them here.
That's the one. They were completely sold out when I went to the Amazon link. So you never got your $2 in commission from me. Sorry.
Dang it.
But I loved it. And you were doing it in a thing about, writing tension cues. Now here's the difference between what I do and between library cues. And this might actually be useful for your audience as opposed to me blabbing about my career for the last half hour. But, there's a difference between writing something to picture, as you've talked about a million times on so many of your podcasts, and structuring library music. Now, I had sort of an innate sense of how library music was structured because I had been using it for years and years. You know, most of the music in our shows comes from libraries. But when I would write something very specific with, you know, something in mind or a scene in mind. But I would always write it with stems. And that turns out being very important in everything I do, and we'll get to that later. But I was basically just writing sort of like what you have called in the past bespoke score. I think you've done that for some of your golf documentaries that you've worked on and stuff, you know, for our shows. I'd give them the stems. They would never survive a hard look structure-wise from a library, but they worked for our shows, you know? And the execs liked them because we had music nobody else had. And they're always like, where'd you get that? And my wife would be like, he wrote it. He's a dork. Like, you know, it's true.
Like the mother of all Swiss Army knives, man.
But I'm a tinkerer. I like to try stuff, you know. Doing it doesn't necessarily mean you're good at it. But I do believe if you can be good enough and the parts work together well enough, then you can justify it.
Right.
So I started watching 52 Qs like religiously. I am almost embarrassed to say that. Not because, you know, just because my wife would be like, are you watching? My kids call you Professor Dave. That's how often you were on. They're like, Daddy, are you watching Professor Dave again? Yes. You know, and you actually introduced me to Taxi, which I've since become friends with Michael Laskow, and that's a whole nother ball of wax, you know, but that's in music-wise that turned me on to writing library music. So I started writing cues with the idea of just more for fun than anything because I enjoyed it. Like, could I write some library cues and get other placements? And since I started watching your channel, you know, I got another library to represent some of my stuff. And I've had like 20, 30 placements in the last year on shows that aren't mine, which I felt like for me, that was a big win. And I give a lot of credit to you and a lot of credit to Taxi from stuff I learned from both of your YouTube channels. But that's sort of like where I'm at with music these days is first and foremost for our shows, can I just do something cool that nobody else has? That would be a pain in the butt for me to explain to a composer because I'm literally pulling sounds out of our TV shows and turning them into cues. And, you know, the ideas are flowing and you're trying this stuff at 3 a.m. when you're not sleeping and you should be, and your hair's turning whiter because you're not sleeping and you should be, you know, and so you get to a cue that's like, oh, at least it sounds different. It's interesting. And by and large, our executives seem to have appreciated that because we try stuff that they haven't heard on the other shows, you know? Yeah. And I just think like once I retire, you know, assuming that music is still a thing and AI doesn't take all our jobs, you know, 20 years from now or whatever, I could see myself just still writing music because I truly love it. And I can go into my room and I can come out with a cue an hour or 3 hours or 3 days later if it's something new I'm learning how to do, but it's finished and it's something that might be useful to somebody. And I don't know, you have a good feeling about like trying something beginning to end.
Yeah.
You know, so that's sort of like how I got into it. And I would say like what I learned more than anything else, and you've hit this really hard in your podcasts. And I heard, I think you quoted somebody who said, stems equal BMWs. Was that you who quoted that?
No, that wasn't me, but I want to know more about this quote. Talk to me.
Yeah. Stems equal BMWs. And I will tell you, and I think, you know, we're going to be talking about this, I think, at an upcoming workshop we're doing together. But when it comes to stems and the way that I work as a television producer who also does a lot of our editing and who has these conversations with editors, stems are everything. Okay. Because I'm never going to have the time to score our show top to bottom. Yeah. Never. And my wife would kill me if I tried. Rightfully so. In case you can tell, she's the smart one that keeps the schedule. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to write some music after I learn how to throw a LUT in OBS and, you know, pick up, you know, this new tip from Adobe Audition. So I'm never going to have enough time to do that. So here's the problem. As a TV producer, I watch these shows, especially in true crime. And no matter how much the networks tell you, we have a library with 2 million cues, it's the same 30 cues on every show, you know, over and over again. And maybe the viewers don't notice, maybe they do.
But the editors do, yep.
The editors do, and the executives do, you know? So when you can't score a show because you don't have the money and you don't have the time, and you have to use library music. What do you do to make your show stand out? When it comes to music, it's to rip that cue apart, treat every stem like a Lego block, and you put them back together in the order that works for your scene. So there's a couple of ways in general I, as an editor, and some of my best editors approach editing a scene. The first is you cut the scene without music. Can I make this scene work on its own? Is it breathing where I want it to breathe? Are the moments landing? Is it engaging even with no music? And for some scenes, that's really important. It's less important if like you're cutting a montage or a transitional scene. Then I like to start with the music.
Okay.
So in those two instances, cues have a very different lifespan in our shows. If it's let's take a true crime show. If it's an interview and, you've got like a mom who's had a very emotional experience and she's talking about what she went through, and it's intercut maybe with photos or reenactments as she's telling the story. A scene like that, I want to stand on its own legs without any music. Once I have it, the perfect cue for a scene like that is any cue where I have a ton of stems, because a scene has a lifespan in the course of post-production. There's the first scene you cut, there's the scene that ends up in the show at the end. And that can be radically different. And where that scene ends up in the linearity of the show almost always changes. So let me run this by you. I've got the scene with this mom telling the story. And the way the show is currently structured, it's an act out. For people who don't know what an act out is, that's like that last scene before commercial. It needs to be emotional, it needs to be driving. The music's got to build to a crescendo, and then, you're going to get the answer when we get back, right? You leave on a cliffhanger. So for that, you need a cue that's got a lot of levels, right? If she's telling this emotional story and I know I need to get to here, but she's over here, I got to find a way to get there. And very, very few cues that are structured in a way a music library would actually want them have that kind of range in 30 seconds, right? So let's say I've got a pad stem and a piano stem, in addition to like 17 other stems, for the cue, which I would say most of the cues we use have between 15 and 25 stems plus a bunch of alts. That's what the cues in our bay look like. So I start with this pad. That's the only thing I'm laying in is the pad. Boom, plop it down. By the way, good tip, always include a pad on tonic, at least for part of your cue, because I'll use it, okay? So now I've got your pad sitting on tonic, which if people don't understand what that means, I Google it. It's easy enough.
Yeah. If they're watching, they probably are.
They probably understand. Yeah. If you're in the key of A minor, please give me, an A drone, at least for part of it. So I've got that pad or that drone in there, and now it's just sitting under the scene. Okay. Now let's say I've got your melody stem. Say I've got your piano stem, and let's say you were smart enough to give me your piano melody separate from your piano low notes. And maybe you went even one farther. Maybe you gave me your piano right hand separate from the left hand, separate from the absolute low notes, okay? I can bring those in and drop them just where I need them, which is going to be guess where? Not when she's talking. Guess what? You have no idea where she's going to be talking when you're writing that cue, right?
That's right.
The only thing you know is you're writing a music cue. So the chances of your melodic notes hitting perfectly when she's not talking are almost zero. But if I have your pad on tonic and I have your melody notes, guess what I can do? I don't even need to listen to the music because you're a pro and you gave me a great cue. So you know what I'm doing? Pad. Okay, I got the notes. She speaks. Pop in a couple notes. She speaks.
Yeah, and you're looking at the waveform. I'm
looking at the waveform.
Yep.
100%. Those waveforms are so important. So now I took your cue that has 17 stems, and in the beginning, I've got just the pads, I got just the melody notes, right? And they're landing just where I want, but I got to get to my act out. So now I start to bring in some of your other stems, right? Is there a light perk? Is there some, is there anything I can use to help build the tension? By the end of the act, can I conceivably get to your full cue? Is that too much because she's emotional? But can I get to 80% of the stems from your cue so that I build myself enough when you're using the emotional scene as an act out to get there? If you gave me the stems, I can. That is cut one that we send to the network. They're going to get 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 of these. And every single time, the way your show is laid out is probably going to change. So now let's say I put your cue in, the cue that you gave me, which thank you, because you had like 20 stems, and I started with your pads and piano and built up from there. And the network comes back and like, this is too emotional. We like this too much. We want to move this up earlier in the scene, earlier in the act. Okay. So now we're coming to this scene in a completely different place, and I need it to be like low key the whole time, right? Well, guess what? I've got your piano stem. I've got your pad stem. I've got maybe if I'm lucky, you give me your low strings and your high strings. I got those to work with. So now your cue stays in the show. Because guess what? It's way easier for me to rip out those other stems and have the cue 90% edited than it is for me to go find another cue when I'm on this crazy tight deadline.
Right.
So you gave me the stems I needed. I dorkily call this cue survivability. I said that for the first time at a taxi thing that I spoke at. And I think it's true because the cues that survive in our shows are the ones that give us the stems. And if I don't have the stems and it's a big enough change, the cue that was in there so beautifully in the first cut of our show is out by the end.
Right.
And that happens probably to about half the cues.
Wow.
Probably half the cues change from the first cut to the last cut, including some of my own that already cued. And the network is like, this sucks. And I'm like, sorry.
I'll go fire that composer.
He's out of here. So that to me is what's so important about working with the cues that I get from these libraries is, do I have these stems and can I future-proof the cue? Let me put that differently. Have you future-proofed the cue? Have you given me the stems I need that I've got the flexibility no matter what? Maybe all I want to start is with your high string stem and run that for 20 seconds. Do I have that? Can I have that? And then maybe I bring the piano in. It's actually your beginning, but I've moved it over and now I've actually rearranged your cue a little bit, like Lego blocks. I think somebody once said, it sounds like you want, what do you call it? Those construction kits? And they're like, it sounds like you want construction kits.
Right.
And I'm like, well, kind of.
I mean, you know what I do, right? I'm constructing a scene here. And yeah, it's we've talked on the podcast about reducing the amount of friction for your editor, whether it's predictable phrasing, and you're not like wild tempo changes and wild metric changes and all these like harmonic gymnastics, because just like what you're talking about, an editor needs these flexible building blocks because they are going to essentially create the underscore with the tools that you give them. And so you're just, I feel really, really validated here because you're saying a lot of what we teach here, which is maximum flex. Now I do want to just clarify for anybody listening. Can you explain some of the terms? You mentioned stems, you mentioned alts, and I know that those terms mean different things in different applications because
different things.
If a mastering engineer is looking for stems, probably looking for something different than what an editor is looking for.
Yes. I could care less if when I add up all your stems, they equal the same loudness as your final output of your cue. And, and a mastering engineer in the old days, right? I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Yep. I'm never going to use your cue that way. If I want your whole cue, I'm going to use your whole cue.
Yeah, because you're not reassembling the mix here, right? You just need little building blocks. Sorry, I interrupted you. I'm so happy to be right.
You are 100% right, my friend. Again, professionals who teach, Dave, that's you. You the man. You know this stuff. Yep. So yes, please know whatever I can do to validate what you say. I've been editing in TV for a long time, and you're 100% right about what makes a cue useful for a TV editor and a producer. And, and I do sit at this weird nexus because I've gone off and written cues and I'm like, this is the greatest cue ever. I love it. And I'll literally go to edit my cue and I'm like, what are you doing, dummy? There's no edit points. The whole thing's a mess. I'm like, it's different headspaces. It really is, so I get it. And sometimes you fall so in love with a piece of music you write and it's useless as an editing tool. I do it too. Guilty as charged. So don't feel bad about that.
Okay.
But yeah, so for stems, for me, it's just like, how many different Lego blocks can you give me of your song? And like some things I like to see, like if there's strings, I like high strings separated from low strings. I like high pads separated from low pads. I also like them together. Like I like a pads high, a pads low, a pads all.
Mm.
I will use all of them at some point. For drums and percussion, it's nice to have the higher shakery, perky, whatever stuff separated out from the lower drums, as well as having the full drums. Those to me are stems.
Mm-hmm.
Alts, and I really use this more only because a lot of music libraries is alts tend to be just a different output of your cue that's meant to be a useful tool for an editor. So like there might be an alt that's like, organic mix, and it's it's sort of like a trailery cue, but they ripped out all of the electronic parts. Or it might be ambient mix. Same thing, all the perk is gone and it's just sort of like the pads and strings and some light stuff. So you'll get these different alts, or you'll get an alt that's like, bass and drums, which is a very common alt to get.
Or no melody mix or no lead mix or something like that.
Exactly. So those, to me, those are alts. Those are sort of like different versions of your full cue that save me the time of having to go and grab 9 stems to equal that alt. Okay. Absolutely. Because if I want that many stems, it's nice to have the alt, at that point. But the stems to me, especially with these delicate scenes, that's where they are so money. And I think that's why I really love that cue that stems equal BMWs, although I don't know if anybody is buying BMWs with ASCAP royalties these days. But if you have the stems, you survive to the end. And you don't get paid, right, on your ASCAP royalties or your BMI royalties or whatever your PRO is unless you air.
Right.
So, so many cues start in our shows and they're gone by the end. That's just the game. Network doesn't like it. Show changes, whatever.
And you don't get paid per the note. So whether it's a pad stem or whether it's the full mix, you will make the same royalties. I had a placement on The Bachelor, and it was, they wanted, the brief called for Australian tension music. Right. And so I'm like, yeah, I play didgeridoo. I'm going to record some didgeridoo. And it was like all these pulses and everything. I worked really hard on it. And do you want to take a guess? What stem, the only stem they ended up using?
I know what stem it is because I love this story. I've heard you tell it like 3 times. It was the didgeridoo, right?
Just the didgeridoo stem. And that was it. And it paid the same as if they used the full mix. And so, Is there like a standard on stems? Is there like amongst editors? I know amongst libraries, it's frustratingly and understandably inconsistent, whether it's loudness or whether it's file formats or stems versus alts versus with you and your editor buddies, because I'm just assuming you all have a super secret handshake and a club you all go to and talk about us composers. And you're like just pretending not to be a composer while you're in there. But is there kind of a standard that we should be shooting for when it comes to deliverables like this?
So I want to say this without being insulting to other editors, but there are some hard truths in this business. And like in any business, you've got a range of people and a range of talents and a range, honestly, of people who care about doing good work versus just care about getting the job done. Stems can be a huge pain in the butt, which is why my belief is that the best editors and the editors who care and the editors who are in it to win it will default to using stems. For those editors, the more stems, the better, to a point. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. There are editors who, look, they come from different backgrounds. They're working with different schedules. Their executive producers don't know anything about music and don't care, and they will slap down a cue, and there it is. There's I'm sure you can picture certain home makeover shows where a cue will just play forever.
This is a 4-bar loop, and this got on air meanwhile.
I would say that the best editors, and also just me who does a lot of editing. And I think at this point I've gotten a handle on it because I've been doing it for a long time. We want more than anything, we want the flexibility to make creative choices with your cue and know that if notes change the cut, we have the flexibility to keep your cue. So honestly, it really speaks to you, again, as an artisan. Can say as an artist if you like. I know some people prefer that term, but it speaks to you having been so thoughtful in the way you construct your cue. Because what you've given me is a toolbox. And with that toolbox, I have the confidence that if I start with your full cue and an act out, and I need to strip it back later because the whole cue has changed, the whole cut has changed because of a network note, I've got what I need. So I like to have a lot of stems. Now, there is a library. I don't want to name them because everybody's going to go bother them. And I love this library, and I use them in all of our shows. Their cues, I'm not exaggerating, have sometimes over 100, sometimes as many as 200 alts and stems.
I think I've worked with this library.
You probably have.
Off air, I'm going to ask if this is the library.
Yeah, it's a lot. I know why they do it, right? Anything you need is there, but there is like sort of a, diminishing returns after a minute when it's, and I keep saying 3 a.m., but I feel like it's usually 3 a.m. when this is happening. When you're digging through and you're like, gotta find a cue and you need the pieces and parts. For me, the sweet spot is like between 10 and 30 of a combination of stems and alts. Usually there's more stems than alts. Somewhere in there, if it's a more sparse cue, look, if your cue is piano and strings,
yeah, there's only so many ways you can peel that apple,
you're gonna skin it. Yeah, still nice to have the parts, but that's gonna be less stems than a trailer cue, know. I think in there 10 to 30, always making sure every stem is the exact same length. Don't only because the way we work with them, and I think we're going to show this off in your workshop, is I stack them up sometimes. Sometimes I'll grab every stem I want, and I literally just stack them up in my edit bay. So I've got them from low to high. At least how that works in my head for that moment. It doesn't really matter what they are, but I'll put them in an order I want, and I'm just cutting between them. I'm dropping 3 stems here and fading in 2 stems there, or I'm cross fading between the same stem because I like the way this part sounds versus that part. And so I build it out, and if they're not the same length, I throw the cue away.
Yeah, and that's the friction point. Because there's only so much friction an editor is going to suffer before it's become too fiddly to work with. You've got a job to do. Your job isn't to get the music on air. Your job is to edit a show. And so if you are putting friction, if you're pouring sand into the gears here, the editor's going to move on. Because chances are you have thousands of other options, and I can imagine that it's super frustrating if you get a cue that's, it's working great, it's perfect, and then you look at all the other options and the stems and alts and everything, and you're just like, this is a great cue, but I can't use it because I don't have the tools that I need to use it properly.
Yeah, and by the way, I understand there's almost like, and because I have it too, right? There's almost a natural defensiveness to any creative endeavor. If you're doing it right, you're putting your heart and soul into it.
Even if you're an artisan, even artisans do put themselves into it. This is fundamentally something that is coming from within us, and we're just asking people to pay us money for it, right? There's no shame in that, but there's part of you is in that. I completely agree.
100%. So by the way, just take that and just multiply it by 10 for my life, because I'm editing, I'm pitching, boy, talk about getting smacked in the face by executives. I can get hit 12 different ways a day, because especially when you take so much on your shoulders, you're also like putting your big nose out there to get punched. Yeah. So I understand. I know it's hard to think, well, I created this beautiful thing and now they're going to change it. At the end of the day, we're all trying to make money, right? Too. And I always tell people, independent filmmakers who I speak to, a lot of them, they really have this because they have this vision for their show or their documentary. And the thing is, a friend of mine who's a filmmaker said, the golden rule, right? And I was like, do unto others? She's like, no, not that one.
I was like, that one from Jesus, this one.
Yeah, he's like, this one. I'm like, what is it? He's like, the one with the gold rules. And I'm like, okay. He's like, you got to do what the customer is paying you to do. That's what you signed up for. And, and it's an interesting place to get your head. Yeah. Because if you want to do something really artistic, especially today in 2025, just go do it. You don't need anyone else's money. You don't need anything from anybody. It wasn't like that when I was getting in the business. But these days,
it's never been easier. The way that I say is like, If you are asking for money, for somebody to pay you for the thing that you have conjured out of thin air, they get to assign value to that until they aren't paying for what you do for them. Rather, they are paying for you. Like when a film company or a director works with John Williams, right? I'm sure John Williams gets very few notes these days, right? But when he was scoring for Chips, back in the 70s, I'm sure he got a ton of notes. So until you are at the level where people are buying you and hiring you for what you do, not for what you can provide, then you have to be okay with somebody else getting to call the shots.
You're so right on. And I think, I've said this about producing, but I think this is true for composing. I think this is true for really any creative endeavor. When you get to a point where you can do something creative enough, where you're good enough to be an artisan or to offer your skills to somebody, eventually you get hired for two reasons. Really, the first time you get hired is because the person they want is not available. Okay, and that's just true. That's how we got our start.
That's how I landed every musical theater gig I've ever had, is because another drummer said no.
It's true. When you're first getting in, I mean, that's the way it is. Once you're sort of established, you get hired for two reasons, I believe. One is your ability to execute, and two is your taste. And if you break those down further, your ability to execute, especially in terms of someone who's hiring you, I think means a few things that are really important. One is, can you get it done on time, on budget? Are you going to come back crying to them that you need more money? You better not. Are you the person who can do that? And is your ability to execute also an ability to say to them in a polite, friendly, collaborative way, the note you just gave me might not work, and here's why. I have a solution for you, and to present them a solution. And that sort of falls into that second bucket, which I think is taste, is after a while, people get to know what you're about. So they're not just buying you, they're buying all the decisions you've done in the past, which is why sometimes it's hard to get into a new genre, or it's hard to get into a new area. What is your track record? But that taste level ties back to that ability to execute, in that you need to be able to save an exec from themselves, because they're and again, it's not because they're dumb. They're overworked. They're watching 9 different TV shows they got on the air. They're not sleeping. They're watching your cuts at 3 in the morning.
And they have somebody to answer to as well.
Yeah. And it's not, trust me, executives, very, very difficult job. So sometimes you get a note and you're like, it's a terrible note. Okay. But you don't go back to them and say, that's a terrible note. So you have to be able to get to a point where that's what they're hiring you for. Your ability to execute and your taste. And so that is very separate from why you might choose to take, an artistic endeavor. We did a documentary that was our biggest documentary. It was a theatrical release called Dying to Do Letterman. And we actually got invited to qualify for Oscar consideration, which was awesome. Oh, wow. We didn't get the nomination. We didn't even get shortlisted, but we got in. The International Documentary Association invites about 20 films each year, and we were one of them.
Wow.
Nobody wanted that project. Nobody. Everybody in town said no. They didn't even want to pay us to do it different, because the project was about a guy whose lifelong dream was to perform on the David Letterman show, and then find out he might only have 5 years to live because he was dying of incurable liver cancer. And he decided to dedicate his life to living his dream. Try telling an executive you're going to deliver on that, right? Try telling them it's going to be funny, we promise, even though we know it's dark material. That's where you go and you pay for it yourself, and you say, we're going to get this done however we get it done. And you lose a bunch of money on it because that's what you do, but it's important enough. And, for us, that was Dying to Do Letterman. And that's something that, it played in theaters. We got distributed by Oscilloscope, which was a huge thing for us. We were so proud of it. We'll never, ever see our money back on that movie, even with all that. But it was something we did because we wanted to. And it was our vision. Nobody else paid for it. In the end, obviously, Oscilloscope, they distribute it, but it's done at that point. They're not making you recut the movie. Whereas when I do a TV show, or if you're a composer writing music, right, it's two very different things. Maybe you really want to write, somebody said to me once they were writing an album that was sort of like a dark electro take on the book of Revelation. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. But That's dark. Like, can you imagine pitching that to extreme music? And they were all, the whole album was like, it was laid out in a way and they were connected and they were, obviously that's not a library album. That's something you're doing for you. Right. On the other hand, if you want to write something that's going to work for your customer, it may not be what's artistic to your core, but you can put enough of yourself into it. Right, you can find that part of the Venn diagram where the circles overlap, and you're like, "Hey, I love this. They love that. This is fun. I liked making it." And I think that is the heart of what you teach. I think that's the heart of people who manage to carve out a living as a creative, is they find that sweet spot. That sweet spot is everything. If you can live there and pay your mortgage or your rent, and drive a car that doesn't break down, I think that's bliss.
Yeah,
I think that's happiness.
And I think that requires you to have a firm understanding on what success means. Like to have made it. If you only say I'll only consider myself successful if I win an Oscar or an Emmy, then you will spend the majority, if not the entirety of your career feeling like a failure. But if you can define success as making air or just finishing a cue, and then you can have incremental successes that will propel and provide momentum into a lifelong career. And so, I firmly believe in that. And for a while I struggled with am I just selling out, because I wanted to be a film composer. I wanted to be the next Alan Silvestri. But what I didn't want to do is move to LA. No offense. I wanted to have boundaries. I wanted to have, I wanted to get married. I wanted to have a house, I wanted to teach, but all the things that would require a career as a film composer didn't appeal to me other than having my music on television, because I had discorrelated, I don't know if that's a word, but I had discorrelated what success meant being a film composer when I really just wanted to have my music with picture. And so once I discovered, wait a minute, I can have that by making production music, and then I was able to redefine what a success and being successful meant to me. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Dude, 100%. And that was why when you did your episode on stoicism, I was, I'm telling you, dude, you got it dialed in. I'm not going to get into, I'm no expert on stoicism. I really enjoy reading about it. I think what I took away from it more than anything else, especially in the context of what we do, is you have no control over, what other people think is your work, right? You have to be able to separate what you actually control from what you don't. And that, by the way, that was hard for me. Because, it's awesome for me to sit here now and be like, oh man, I was so lucky to be on Kenan and Kel. But at the time I was so mad that I didn't get the Coen Brothers movie, Right. Now I look back and I'm like, I was so lucky to meet those guys. And, and I'm sure who they cast was better for the role than I was, right. They're the Coen Brothers. They know what they're doing.
Right.
But you have got to be able to put yourself in a place where you understand what you have control over, which is, hey, you can improve your skills. You can write a piece of music you love for you. You can write a piece of music you love for a library. You can control how you feel about it at the end. You have no control over how it's received. And when I make a show and I'm personally responsible, again, you put your big nose out there, you get punched in the face, right? For so many different parts of it, and my wife as well, our names are all over it. We're doing everything yeah, there's plenty of room for people to be like, you suck.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, I'm putting myself out there on YouTube. I'm running a community as, one of the experts in the industry. It's not expecting expecting not to get punched, or not to deal with rejection is like a boxer not expecting to get punched. No, a boxer's job isn't to not get punched. A boxer's job is to take a punch and still keep throwing punches. That's what a boxer's job is.
Love that.
And so, yeah, if you expect to never feel the sting of rejection, then you're not trying hard enough. I know that's like an after school special moment, dad wisdom for you, but that's how I feel about it.
By the way, that dad wisdom is what I'm trying to impart on my kids right now. Because let me tell you something. When you're growing up in Cleveland like I did, and you want to get into showbiz and you want to act and you want to make movies, I'm going to hasten to guess that for most people like myself, at first it's for the wrong reasons. You're chasing fame, you're chasing money, you're chasing all the things that you can't control in life, you know?
Right.
I consider myself so lucky that I met my wife, that we get to do something we like, that, you know, we pay our bills with it. That's enough for me, you know? And I've met people who are way more successful than I am. Some of them are really happy. Some of them are miserable.
Yep.
It's the same on the other end of the scale. You'll learn really quick, especially when you move to Hollywood and you have your first run-ins with celebrities and different people. Clearly, money and success has nothing to do with happiness. They're different things.
Agree. Yeah, completely agree, which is why, you know, in that Venn diagram that you mentioned, my episode on, you know, find what you're good at, find what you love, and find what they're buying, and spend your career pushing those together as much as you can. Because if you might have success, you can't out earn unhappiness. You just can't. There will be a threshold to where the misery cannot be sated by a paycheck or by royalties or any level of success if you are fundamentally unhappy.
100%. And listen, it's easy for me to sit here and say that now, you know, and I understand there's people that are watching this that are completely flat broke. Mm-hmm. I've been there. I lived in that one-bedroom apartment in Hollywood.
Me and my wife were on food stamps in college. I get it.
You know, and so it's hard to hear that, and it's easy for you to say. I promise you, I was as broke as anybody out there. There were times when I was happy. There were times when I was miserable, and it turns out it had nothing to do with money.
Yep.
So of course you gotta carve out a living. I don't want anybody to be like, I'm like, oh yeah, just, you know, decide in your head you're happy.
Even you mentioned earlier you were on Kenan and Kel, and did you have a day job or a night job?
Listen, this is the most humbling thing in the world. I got on Kenan and Kel. This was, you know, the 90s, right? So it didn't pay a lot. It was AFTRA, bottom of the barrel. I didn't care. I was lucky. I still worked at Pizza Hut. Okay, this is the most humbling thing in the world for me. If you watch the show, one of my characters' things was I would do this goofy dance. It was basically a modified MC Hammer. So, for people who remember that, right? I mean, they would always rut me in some kind of goofy dance move. And so we would do the show in front of a live studio audience. My dream, right? I mean, as an aspiring actor, you're like, I'm here. Right. I'm with the two-star, you know, and we would do the curtain call at the end, and I'd come out, and they'd be like, it is Mark Cram, Biagio Messina. And I'd come out, and I'm dancing, and the audience is cheering. I kid you not, I am not exaggerating. Within 1 hour of that, I was wearing my Pizza Hut uniform, delivering pizzas. I'm not kidding. Honest to goodness, a Friday night, I would tape on a Friday night, and then I would go deliver pizzas that same Friday night. It was the most humbling experience of my life, but probably one of the best. I never, ever once, by the way, got recognized when I was on the show, which was hilarious. And certainly nobody thought they're a Pizza Hut driver.
You didn't do the dance I didn't do the dance. To the here's your pizza.
Did not do that. You know, and so that was a thing, you know. So even when I was, you know, and the crazy thing was, you know, people from Cleveland, the people who knew me as Tweety Bird at the mall, you know, or they thought I was rich. I started getting letters from people who would get my address, and they'd be like, you know, I ran into this financial difficulty. I'm like, I'm literally eating ramen noodles 7 days a week, sometimes twice a day, because at the time they were still less than $1 a pack, right?
Right.
Like people don't realize that that doesn't equal money. So yes, so I was living my dream, and still completely broke, but I was happy. You know, and I was like, all right, at least I'm doing it. And it was that balance. I didn't learn till years later to really separate what you can control from what you can't.
Yeah.
But if you can get yourself there, even in the hard times, and you can say, all right, I have no control over what this person thinks of my work, what they're saying about me, or how what I've just done put into the world. But I really, really enjoyed what I made in the end.
Yeah.
I learned something new, you know, whatever.
Yeah. When you have that kind of grounding at the lowest, you know, then when you start finding success, then you are, I believe you're much better at handling it. And so, that's when you said like, hey, I worked at Pizza Hut, like I can't imagine that cognitive dissonance of, I was just crushing it. People were cheering for me and Yes. No, yes, I do take tips. Yes. Thank you. Yep.
You want to hear a great funny side story?
Of
I'll
course.
tell you. Okay, you think that? Let me tell you this, right? So when I was on the show, I used to drive in when I was acting there, and I left the Pizza Hut car topper on top of my car because I wanted everybody to know I was broke, and I was hoping that would bring me back more often. They all knew I worked for Pizza Hut. Well, one day I'm working in the daytime, not acting this week. I wasn't on every episode. It was like every couple weeks I would be in, and I had this order. I could not find the address. I'm driving all up and down Hollywood trying to find this address. I'm 10 minutes late. I'm 20 minutes late. I'm 30 minutes late. I mean, it was getting really, really late, right? And then I realized the address was the Nickelodeon studio for Kenan and Kel. And the pizza was going to the crew. And this was their lunch break. And I was late. And I was like,
come on.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it was just a cognitive dissonance, if I was blocking it. I showed up to deliver the pizza. And I knew the guy who was the head of the crew. Of course, he was always nice to me when, they're always nice to the actors. This guy was so mad. And I knew the whole crew was waiting on their food, And he's like, what the? And he looks at me and he goes, Biagio? And I'm like, day job. I'm so sorry. He calls, they all start laughing. They tipped me like $20.
Oh, man.
But it was still so it was such worlds colliding. And I just remember I was so embarrassed and I felt so bad and I felt like I ruined their guys' lunches. But the next time I was on the show and I walked in, everybody started clapping for all the crew guys. And they were like, we know you're one of us. And I'm like, I am, dude, I am. So, but anyways, it's it's been a ride.
Speaking of world colliding, one of the things that we have coming up, this is for our family and friends subscribers, is a workshop with you on May 7th at 4 p.m. Eastern, again, for our family and friends subscribers, because one of the things that I think is so valuable for us composers and for you being, I mentioned the Swiss Army knife, you're like the mother of Swiss Army knives in this space, right? Is for us composers to really have a firm understanding on how music is used, not just theoretically, but to actually see it being done. And you have such a deep perspective because you make TV, you edit TV, you've written music for TV, you absolutely know what to do and what not to do. So can we talk a little bit about the workshop that you have coming up?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was like so honored that you asked me. I know it sounds dumb, but I'm still a little starstruck talking to you and seeing the drums behind your head and
crazy,
the resonator guitar and like all the stuff that I've come to know from. So I can't believe I'm here. But I really appreciate you asking. I think there's a couple of things that hopefully will be helpful. One of the things is I want musicians to see how I look at your stems, okay? Because I use a program called Expose for a whole lot of different reasons. But I drag all the stems in there because I want a top-down view. I want to see what every stem looks like. And there's red flags that like if I see this or I don't see that, I'm like, this cue's out. So I thought it would be fun to pull in some of their cues, talk through what I'm seeing right off the bat, because if you never make it in the bay, it doesn't matter anyway, right? So I wanted to talk through that. I got permission. I have to watermark it and obscure some identities, but I got permission from the powers that be to take some scenes from a couple of our shows. And what I'm hoping to do with at least a few of the cues, I can't do it with all of them. We don't have the time, but at least a few of the cues is live edit. So I want to actually pull some 52 Cues members' cues into the bay and just show you, hey, here's how I work with your cue. This is what I'm thinking. This is the scene. This is how I'm laying your cue down. This is what I'm thinking about in case the show changes. This is why your cue makes it. This is why your cue doesn't. And just in general, I want to give that list of the things I call cue survivability because there's a lot of reasons why your cue ends up in the first version of our show and is long gone by version 3, 5, 7, 10 sometimes if it's a pilot, and some cues make it all the way through. Yeah. You want to be the cue that makes it all the way through. So if that could be helpful. And again, I think, because I have no ego, because I've been yelled at by every kind of executive for every kind of creative thing, I think I can, commiserate and share your pain about, why cues get used or why they don't. And just, hopefully get you to a mindset, wherever you're at in your composing career, where when you're writing for this space, you maybe approach it from a different angle.
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. To see the process, let alone being done by somebody as genuine and as authentic as you, but also a real pro at their craft who understands the pain of being a composer and the artisan brain. And I'm selfishly looking forward to this. But if you are a family and friends subscriber, you can go ahead and RSVP right now over in the workshop space. And we have room for you to submit your cues. And there's a whole rundown because we kind of put up a little mini brief, for everybody. And but Biagio, man, thank you so much for joining me today. Congratulations on all your success. And
to you too.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. And you've been so generous, not just with your time here under the workshop, but with everything you've done for the 52 Cues community. You've really helped several of our composers along. And so just know that I appreciate you, and I'm so glad to have you among us here in the community. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do, and please keep doing it. YouTube and the world needs more channels like yours.
Once again, a huge thanks to Biagio for joining me today on the podcast. And as always, we'll have his links in the description, so you definitely want to check those out. And don't forget, Biagio is going to be joining us again here in the community for a workshop on Wednesday, May 7th at 4 p.m. Eastern. And this is exclusively for the family and friends subscribers, where he's going to be walking us through his full editing process. He's going to be building a scene in real time. He's going to be working with stems and showing exactly how cues get shaped to picture. So if you've ever wanted to kind of look over an editor's shoulders, this is your chance. You can RSVP to that right now over in the workshops space. So we're going to take a quick break, but when we return, I'm going to give my thoughts on Equation, which is a TV drama cue written by 52 Cues member James Oakden. We'll be right back. Every week I talk about how this episode and the podcast and the community, the channel, would not be possible without the amazing support of our family, friends, and neighbors, subscribers of 52 Cues, who do pay their actual real-life money to keep all of this going. And in addition to being thriving members of the community, as well as supporting me and Shannon and everything that we're doing here, they also receive extra perks like live streams, workshops, Zoom feedback sessions, hundreds and hundreds of hours of video archives, weekly cue breakdowns, production music almanac, living ebook, and the opportunities to submit to real music libraries. Now, it's free to join 52 Cues. You can just go to 52cues.com and sign up, be a member of the community. We would love to have you. It will always be free to join the community. But if you've been watching, or if maybe this is your first time, but if you're wondering, is there a way to kind of level up my production music skills in the industry, meeting like-minded, super friendly, very generous composers? Then why don't you think about subscribing? Memberships start at around $4 a month, and we would love to have you. Again, that's 52cues.com. So that was Equation by James Oakden. James, thank you so much for sending this along. I really did enjoy this. I think there's a lot of really good things happening with the cue, and I made some notes. The thing that stuck out with me right out of the gate is this feels more like opening titles, or credits or closing credits, that kind of thing. Because it's telling a very complete story, in terms of the cue structure and everything else. We're kind of building up until around the minute mark, and then we pull energy back, but we're shifting kind of into a different mood or an emotion here, because we've shifted the rhythmic language, the harmonic language, and then we kind of come back out of that going like a return to A. So we have a real ABA form. And so I think something like this could work as main titles. The challenge, though, is that most shows aren't getting their titles from library music. They're not necessarily getting them from a catalog. And most of the titles that you see on a show are done bespoke. They are, by a custom composer. But even a show that uses a lot of library music will commission a title sequence to a production company or to a specific composer. Now, that's not to say that production cues can't be titles. I mean, Curb Your Enthusiasm, that show famously uses a production music track for its main title. That that kind of like clown circus music for Curb Your Enthusiasm was put in from a library, and then I guess they licensed it. And so it doesn't mean don't do these types of cues. It just means that it might be more of an uphill battle when trying to get it placed into a library, because you have to think, as a library, how do I place this? How do I pitch this? So some mixing notes is I felt like things were pretty kind of sibilant, like the percussion is really kind of crisp. And it's popping out of the mix just a little bit here. I would probably chill out those clacks there at the top. But what I do like is the ostinato, the pulsing ostinato. I like the strings, even though I think the strings could probably come down in the mix a little bit. One thing that I try to kind of adhere to, and I received this feedback from a publisher, which is anything that is moving gets prominence, and anything that is sustained gets pushed back in the mix, especially with like a tensiony pulsing type of a cue like this. Especially when you think it kind of down in the mix that it might be, then a lot of those sustained sounds can just kind of be overrepresented a little bit. And I wonder if the percussion can be more of a halftime kind of a thing. So instead of boot, cat, boot, what if we did like a boot, cat, that type of feel? Because this sounds a little bouncy and makes it feel a little dated in the kind of Stephen Bochco, L.A. Law kind of way. Yeah, it just sounds a little synth pop. But if we do like some halftime percussion, that might be effective. And yeah, there's an instance where things are getting a little sibilant. And if we look at our peaks, yeah, we're getting up to 0.0. So we're not technically clipping the output bus, but it is making my meters red. If we look at here, I am starting to clip the meters. So generally, if you want to get as close to unity gain as possible, I will shoot for a -0.2. I think doing -1 keeps it very, very safe. What's good, though, is you have a very healthy looking waveform. We're not like smashing into the limiter here. We're looking pretty good. I would trim out, we've got too much leading silence. And it looks like there's some kind of some noise. I don't know if this is room tone or something. Let's open this up in RX and see what we got. Yeah, we've got some noise here that we would want to address. Don't necessarily want to keep that in our cue, and I would trim off everything up to about 200 milliseconds or so. So if I were to put kind of that, because I have a 200 millisecond marker on my template, and then anything that is below that, and then you can see it starts almost immediately. All right, so I would bring the percussion down, bring the sibilance of the percussion down. I would do some halftime drums coming out. If I were to try to kind of wrangle this into like a tension cue, an investigation type of a cue, what I would do is I would hang out on the 1 chord here. Also be careful, you're bringing in those pizzicato strings, and it's getting a little swimmy, a little hopeful. And again, that's fantastic for titles, for main titles, but I'm not sure having this kind of positive thing, a positive section in the middle of the cue. I don't know. I did want this to be resolved. And then going into this next section. But if we kind of just chilled out on the minor 1 chord, that could work. And looking at that edit point, we might want a little bit more of a consistent taper here, just so it's not. Yeah, there's a little kind of bump in there. I don't know. I just probably use a cleaner edit point. And speaking of, let me get rid of isotope there in the background. Yeah, and here is where it's feeling really, really poppy. Also, make sure that your strings, those long strings, make sure they're not a little bit behind the beat, and that's something we need to do, is like manually move those either with a negative delay or moving the MIDI notes themselves. We are getting pretty loud here. Getting into the -7s. Even though we're not crushing the limiter, the loudness itself is pretty darn loud. All right, so we have a cliffhanger, non-downbeat, non-tonic ending. The bold choice, Cotton. Let's see if it plays out. Again, for titles, maybe. For your kind of garden variety investigation cues, maybe not. This makes my brain itch. I'm like, you can even make it an edit point, and then boom, just give the editor an ending they can use, even if you kind of have your cake here and eat it too. So also make sure this is nice and clean if you're gonna go cliffhanger. And so, yeah, it's like we have a transient here for the boom, but the cymbal scrape is a little bit off. So we'd want to tighten that up to just so it's all connected and everybody is arriving to that endpoint at the same time. So at the end of the day, I think we have the bones of something good here. I wonder if it would be more usable if we kind of treated it more like a tension cue. But as titles, we're in pretty good shape here. Yep, we've done some really good layering, some building of your energy, and we're kind of heightening emotion as we go through the cues. So I think this is working for a title. Now, actually landing a title gig, that's a whole other topic, and I think that might be a bit of an uphill climb because While a show might have 80 to 100 different investigation cues and tension cues and that kind of thing, it's only going to have one title cue. And considering that those get used over and over, they're considered title placements versus featured placements versus background placement. So it's the highest payout. It's every single week, which is why competition is really fierce and they tend to be custom jobs. So thank you so much for sending this along, James. I really, really do appreciate you. And, if you would like feedback on your own cues, we've got weekly feedback threads that we put up every single week over in the 52 Cues community. This is where members can post cues, they can share comments and support and give feedback on other cues. And while you're there, you can go ahead and submit your own cue for consideration to be featured right here on the podcast. And let's say you're ready to level up your writing and you want consistent, ongoing feedback. Well, we host live feedback sessions twice a week for our family subscribers, and would really love for you to join us there. And if that isn't enough, you can go to 52cues.com / I'm doing this in real time here, /coaching, where you can get personalized feedback, where you can order up video critiques, or you can even book a one-on-one coaching session. Again, you can head over to 52cues.com / coaching. But that's going to do it for me this week. Be sure to tune in next week, where we're going to be talking about something a little more personal. The small, everyday choices we make as composers and how those choices quietly shape our growth over time. We're not necessarily talking about gear, and we're not really going to be talking about talent. It's the habits we build, the mindset we bring, and the decisions we make when no one's watching. So I hope you will join me for that. But until then, I want to thank you for spending part of your day here with me. I know you have a ton of options out there on YouTube or listening on the podcast, audio. So the fact that you chose to hang out with me just for a bit today really does mean a lot. And if you got value out of today's episode, the best way you can pay it forward is to like, subscribe, and go ahead and leave a comment. It really does help composers just like you find me. So I hope you've had an amazing week, and I know that you're going to have an amazing week next week. How do I know that, and why do I believe that? It's because I trust that the universe has amazing plans just for you. Until next time, peace. The 52 Cues podcast is copyright 2025 818 Studios, all rights reserved. The music played on the podcast is copyright of their respective owners and is used with permission and for educational purposes only. For more information, including joining the community, submitting your cue for review, or becoming a member subscriber of 52 Cues, head over to 52cues.com.